I'm Will Curtis. I'm currently Director of Academic Studies in Centre for Lifelong Learning. My academic interest is in radical education, alternative education. We probably haven't moved as far as I'd like us to, but we are moving in terms of pedagogy. We're moving towards a more democratic, enlightened notion of learning and teaching, that learning involves activity, learning involves doing things and constructing things with one another and those kinds of things. And what I would argue is we haven't moved very far in terms of how we think about assessment and feedback. So you might have a very fluid, democratic, participatory learning space, and then you go away and write an exam in a timed condition, and somebody that you don't know will mark it and give it a grade. And that's very beneficial for employers or for future education systems and so on, because it's very neat and tidy, and you get a mark and you can say this person's done better than this person. But a lot of that's very artificial, and I think what we do is we hide behind systems to avoid the very messy, human, difficult, problematic bits of evaluating somebody's work or contribution to work. I think we could do more with assessment and feedback in terms of encouraging students to operationalise learning outcomes themselves. So I have used, in previous modules, assessment activities where we will write the assessment criteria together. So we'll have a list of the learning outcomes. These are the things you need to demonstrate. What kinds of things would you need to demonstrate well to be able to meet those learning outcomes? And then assessment criteria become something quite different. They become something that you've agreed together that are meaningful, that relate to the learning outcomes, rather than something that can feel completely excluding or meaningless, which is a series of, evaluation and interpretation, presentation and use of evidence, those kinds of things. So I think that's a really important first step. And then I think you can go further with that. So in terms of the benefits, one thing that does happen quite a lot at Warwick is that students are able to write their own question or their own essay task. I think you can go much further than that, and I do go further than that, and say, here are the learning outcomes, present that to me in an assignment in whatever way you think you can meet those learning outcomes in the best way. I think doing something like that is very empowering. It's a level of reflection that's, for me, is a slightly higher level than I've chosen to answer the question for rather than one of the other ones. You have to engage as a learner in those learning outcomes so that you're making sure that you meet them. The onus is on you rather than on somebody else telling you what to do. So I think that's very empowering, it's very developmental. It helps you to understand what grading descriptors and learning outcomes and assessment criteria are, and that's very useful for the learner going forward. So the module I teach at Warwick is a module that is run through IATL. IATL allow you to be a little bit more interesting with the pedagogies and the assessment and feedback and so on. And I teach a module called Reinventing Education, and the module is really about why we might think about getting rid of schools and colleges and universities and looking at alternative models of learning and education and so on. We spend a week on the module looking at assessment and feedback and arguing that current practices are deeply problematic, that they're very bad for learners, they're bad for the relationships between learners and teachers, they're very bad for the way that learners engage with knowledge, our relationships to knowledge, and what they tend to do is reward people for memorising and regurgitating established sets of knowledges. It's a self-selecting module. The people who have chosen the module are quite interested in trying out different ways of learning and teaching and so on. And given that we have a week looking at why current assessment feedback practices are problematic, it would be very difficult to use traditional assessment and feedback. Although when I first had the module approved, I had to have an exam in it because of the 50-50 rule. So the exam had questions in it. The original exam had questions in it like, is an examination a legitimate way of assessing students' performance? Which is a very interesting kind of postmodern kind of metacognitive thing. But now I've reduced it, there's only one assessment, it's a big assessment, and there's one assessment because the students have done it so well for the last 4 years. It's definitely been the best work that I've ever assessed. So what they do is they're asked to design an educational utopia or dystopia. That's the brief. It's entirely up to them how they do that, and it's entirely up to them what kind of setting this utopia or dystopia is. So it might be 5 years from now in England, it might be 500 years from now on planet Zircon or whatever. It can be whatever they like, and it can be a utopia or a dystopia based on a small aspect of education, like assessment and feedback, or the classroom space, or the school building, or or it can be much more widespread, an entire new educational system for a world, or so they can do whatever they like with that, and they can present it however they like. And all that they've got to help them is the assessment criteria. So do what you like, that's an educational utopia or dystopia, but make sure that you meet these criteria. That's what you're being marked against. And so students do get anxious about it. They're finalist students. They're not used to that kind of autonomy, I guess, or responsibility. And they go away and they make fantastic, original, creative things. And I think, one of the challenges made against innovative assessment is that it lacks rigour, that it's less challenging than more established methods. I really don't believe that. I think if you look at FHEQ level 6 descriptors, as in what final year undergraduate students ought to be demonstrating, this task does that more effectively than a more traditional assessment. So they're engaging in speculative inquiry. They're using current evidence and applying that to future or non-human contexts. And so the kinds of things that students have presented, they've made paintings, they've written short stories, they've made websites, they've done plays, written plays, they've made kind of video diaries, they've done all sorts of very, very interesting work.